Okay, ma'am, we are live. We can begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second webinar from ISAR, which is sponsored by Zydus. I would be speaking today on evidence for reproductive surgery in female infertility. All of us know that almost 40% of the cases of infertility are due to inadequate seminal quality, 30% because of inadequate ovarian function, whereas the remaining 30% are due to presence of pelvic factors of infertility. The different therapeutic options for infertility in the presence of adequate seminal and ovarian function is either bypassing the pelvic factor, either by performing IVF or the treatment of pelvic factor by reproductive surgery, which is to optimize the implantation of blastocyst in the uterine cavity for an optimal outcome. If you look at the different pathologies, what we encounter, in the uterus, we could either have the polyps, the fibroids, adenomyosis, Mullerian anomalies, or adhesions. The tubal factor includes hydrosalpinx, blocked tubes, tubal obstruction, and when a woman has undergone sterilization surgery. The ovarian and peritoneal factors are endometriosis and adhesions. We know that uterine pathologies such as polyps, submucous fibroids, intrauterine adhesions, Mullerian anomalies, and adenomyosis can decrease the implantation rate and therefore may require surgery. When we talk about endometrial polyps, it has been seen that hysteroscopic removal of endometrial polyps, which are detected by ultrasound, significantly double the clinical pregnancy rate when compared to a diagnostic hysteroscopy and polyp biopsy, and the numbers needed to treat is 3. That is, if we operate on every 3 subfertile women with polyp, we would have 1 additional pregnancy. Coming to reproductive surgery for fibroids, we know that submucous fibroid adversely affects the reproductive outcome, and therefore its removal is mandatory and improves the outcome, whereas there is insufficient evidence as the high quality studies are lacking to know the impact of intramural fibroid or removal of intramural fibroid on the reproductive outcome. This meta-analysis, which was published in 2010, has clearly shown a favorable effect of surgery when done for a submucous myoma. And this was another RCT which was published where they compared 101 women who underwent a hysteroscopic myomectomy as against 103 who just underwent a diagnostic hysteroscopy, and we can clearly see that the clinical pregnancy rate is significantly higher when a myomectomy is performed, which is about 63.4%, as against 28.2% when only a diagnostic hysteroscopy is done. Then coming to intramural myomas, which do not distort the cavity, we have controversial views. There are certain studies which show that it does negatively affect the IVF results, whereas others which show that they do not affect the IVF results. And therefore, then we are in a dilemma whether we should operate or we should not operate. So if you look at myomas, which are more than 5 centimeters in size, there are studies which have shown that it reduces significantly the pregnancy rates by 40%. And we can see that the implantation rates drop from 20 to 12%, pregnancy rates from 34 to 23%, and ongoing pregnancy rate from 28 to 15%. And so we can say that large intramural myomas may affect negatively the pregnancy outcome after IVF, and therefore their removal is mandatory prior to IVF. The controversy comes if the myoma is smaller than 5 centimeters. Again, here we have contradictory evidence, whereas the first paper, which was published in 2002 by Check et al., said that there is no difference in the implantation and pregnancy rates. But even these fibroids, which are smaller than 5 centimeters, are associated with lower live birth rate as well as high miscarriage rate. But they concluded that we require further RCTs to say that they need to be removed. Whereas there were other papers, and the Oliveira et al. Published in 2004 said that there's no effect on the pregnancy rates as well as miscarriage rates. But there is quite a bit of evidence on the junctional zone intramural myomas because they're known to have an unfavorable ART outcome as compared to other intramural myomas, and therefore myomectomy should be considered for all junctional zone myomas. Coming to intrauterine adhesions, at present, there are no RCTs or case control trials which have compared hysteroscopic treatment of intrauterine adhesions to a control, and therefore, we really cannot have a strong evidence for intrauterine adhesiolysis. The pregnancy rate reported was about 30 to 50% post surgery with a live birth rate of 10 to 35%. And we need to identify the poor prognostic indicators, which include adhesions which are obliterating both the ostia. If the woman's age is more than 35 years, she has history of amenorrhea and oligomenorrhea, and she has abnormal ultrasound appearance, and there is reformation of adhesions at the second locoscopy. But if you look at this paper, wherein it compared the reproductive outcome of the hysteroscopic treatment of Asherman syndrome in women who had infertility and in women who had more than 3 pregnancy losses. And we can see over here that the surgery definitely improved the live birth rate in both these groups. There were other 2 papers which looked at the menstrual pattern as well as the formation of a healthy uterine anatomy. And we can see that regular menstruation returned in about 60 to 95% of the cases, whereas healthy uterine anatomy restoration varied with different studies. It was as low as 43% in a study published in 2006 and as high as 93% in a study published by Pace et al. In 2003. And if you look at the pregnancy outcome, we can see that there is a different increase in the clinical pregnancy rate, apart from restoration of the menstrual pattern as well as anatomy. And there was improvement in the live birth rate as well as term pregnancies, and also the incidence of abortion and premature deliveries significantly reduced. The other uterine anomaly, what we come across is the septum. And we know that septum was the commonest anomaly which was found in the infertile population, whereas patients who had an arcuate uterus were seen more commonly in the general population and in those who had recurrent abortions. And if you look at the term delivery rate, it was only about 22% in the presence of a septum as compared to a normal where it was almost 80% and in an arcuate uterus where it was almost 65%. And we can also see that the first trimester abortion rate was significantly higher in the presence of the septum as compared to arcuate uterus and a normal uterine cavity. And post septal recession, we can see that the live births increased from 20% to almost about 82%, and the abortion rate reduced from 40% to about 18%. And therefore, resection of the septum definitely improves the outcome of pregnancy. So do we resect all septums? The answer is no. Initially, it was thought that if the distance f, that is, if we draw a line between the 2 ostia and then a vertical line to the tip of the septum, if that is more than 10 millimeters, it had to be definitely operated. But today, the evidence has changed, and this distance has become 6 millimeters, and this was after the RCTs which were conducted and which showed an ROC curve wherein 5.9 millimeters was thought to be a cutoff level. Coming to management of patients with T-shaped uterus, and we know that it is totally controversial and beneficial effect of hysteroscopic metroplasty is questionable with no prospective studies or randomized control trials. Gavin et al. In 2006 reported that lateral metroplasty is associated with cervical incompetence, hysteroscopic endometritis in about 1 to 5% of the cases, destruction of the normal endometrium due to use of monopolar cautery, and development of intrauterine adhesions, uterine perforation at surgery, and an increased incidence of uterine rupture during pregnancy. They also reported an increased risk of miscarriage, which was about 22%, and that of premature deliveries was about 22%. And the incidence of adherent placenta was also significantly higher. They also reported an increased incidence of cesarean section. Gavin et al. In his earlier paper, which consisted only of 24 cases and published in 1998. And there were other two papers by Paringa et al. In 2002 and Eisenboza in 2019, where all these number of cases in these studies were less. But these studies did show increase in the live birth rate after lateral metroplasty. And due to the small case series and no controls, we have to take these results with a little bit of pinch of salt. So lateral metroplasty should not be the first line of treatment and should be reserved only for symptomatic patients. We know that adenomyosis is associated with decreased pregnancy rates as well as increase in the abortion rate and decreased live birth rates. We could either have a diffuse adenomyosis or we could have a focal adenomyosis. And junctional zone adenomyosis affects the pregnancy rates much more than the other variety of adenomyosis. And this is because it results in dysregulation of the myometrial architecture as well as it results in altered endometrial function. And this study, which was published in 2014, looked at the pregnancy rates after adenomyomectomy, and they divided the patients into complete and partial adenomyomectomy. The ones in the complete group were much higher as compared to those who underwent partial adenomyomectomy. And we can see that the pregnancy rates were much higher when complete adenomyomectomy was done as compared to partial adenomyomectomy. And the spontaneous pregnancy rates were almost similar in both the groups. And only patients who underwent complete adenomyomectomy, that is a small percentage of 11.5%, required ART for their conception. And if you look at the pregnancy outcome, there was no difference in the pregnancy rates, term pregnancy rates between the two groups, but definitely the abortion rate was much higher when partial adenomectomy was done as compared to when complete adenomyomectomy was done. One must remember that adenomyomectomy can result in reduction in myometrial capacity, increased abortion, premature labor, uterine rupture, as well as there is increased incidence of cesarean section. And most important is that it requires an experienced surgeon. Coming now to the tubal defects, we have hydrosalpinx, and all of us know that it can result in impairment of the ovarian function, follicular development, as well as the oocyte quality. It can also result in endometrial damage, which can affect the endometrial receptivity and inhibit embryo implantation. It also has a dilutional effect of the hydrosalpinx fluid on essential nutrients and substrates, and this can also have a direct cytotoxic effect on the gametes as well as the embryos. It can also result in an inflammatory response with production of pro-inflammatory cytokines and also result in mechanical washout of embryos after an ART procedure. So probably we therefore need to operate on these patients, and the different types of surgery that can be performed includes a salpingectomy, a salpingostomy where we open up the hydrosalpinx as seen over here. Then we could also do proximal tubal occlusion, especially when we have these type of adhesions wherein we really cannot trace the entire tube and the bubble is close to the tubes, or we could do aspiration of the fluid from the hydrosalpinx transvaginally under ultrasound control. But the results of salpingoplasty will depend on the experience of the surgeon as well as the state of the tubal mucosa. So if you look at these two case studies, here the surgeries were done in a non-specialty hospital, and we find that the term delivery rate was only 5% as compared to 34% when it was done in a specialty hospital. And therefore, experience of the surgeon is very important, plus the equipments which are required for the surgical procedure is also very important. And in 2011, Pottelot et al. Reported a pregnancy rate of 18.2 to 48%, and the success rate varied depending on the state of the tubal mucosa and the expertise of the surgeon. So, inappropriate selection of the patient for surgery will decrease the chance of pregnancy by delaying IVF especially if the patient is more than 37 years of age, has decreased ovarian reserve, and has presence of abnormal tubal mucosa, and if the surgeon lacks training in tubal surgery. Coming to salpingostomy, in the treatment of hydrosalpinx, if we look at this systemic review and meta-analysis, they reported a natural pregnancy rate of 27% with a live birth rate of 25% and an ectopic pregnancy rate of 10% and a miscarriage rate of 7%. But if you look at the cumulative clinical pregnancy rate, we can see that it increased only till a period of 12 months, and after that it was stagnant. So if a patient does not conceive after salpingostomy, after 1 year of surgery, this patient should then be offered IVF as a treatment modality. Now coming to salpingectomy in patients who have severe hydrosalpinx and the mucosa is totally destroyed, and we can see that the wall is totally thinned out. Here, laparoscopic salpingectomy should be considered, and it has shown to improve the implantation as well as the pregnancy rates, and also reduces the risk of recurrent tubal pregnancy. The proximal tube should be coagulated and divided close to the cornu, and the mesosalpinx serially coagulated and cut, staying close to the tubes to avoid compromised ovarian blood supply. Because if you move away from the tube, we can see that we could compromise the blood supply to the ovaries, and this then would decrease the ovarian reserve and the number of oocytes obtained. It has been shown that even unilateral salpingectomy in the presence of unilateral hydrosalpinx has resulted in significant improvement in IVF pregnancy rates. And the numbers needed to treat is 7. That is, if we do 7 surgeries, you would have 1 additional pregnancy. In patients where salpingectomy is risky or not possible because of adhesions, one could do proximal tubal obstruction, and this could be done hysteroscopically by using Assure. Though initially it was used rampantly, later on this device was taken off the market due to inferior pregnancy rates and higher miscarriage rates, and probably this could be because some part of the spring was seen at the inside the uterine cavity. We could do proximal tubal division, wherein we could cauterize it with the bipolar cautery and then disconnect the tube, or we could apply cornual clips, or we could do a transvaginal needle aspiration, and then we could inject this with sclerosing agents so that the hydrosalpinx does not reform easily and quickly. And if you look at the results of proximal tubal division, either after coagulation or clipping, we can see that there is a definite increase in the clinical pregnancy rates as well as the live birth rates. But the only concern of disconnecting the proximal part of the tube is that it may lead to increase in the size of hydrosalpinx, as the fluid can no longer drain through the uterus. And for this reason, consultation may be given for widely fenestrating the hydrosalpinx at the time of proximal occlusion. And if we compare salpingectomy versus occlusion, if we can see that there's no difference in the results, and both have resulted in improvement of IVF pregnancy rate, and the average pregnancy rate was about 21.7% higher after surgery, and the numbers needed to treat was about 9. Fallopian catheterization can also be done when we have proximal tubal occlusion. And in this systemic review, which was published in 2017, we can see that a spontaneous pregnancy rate of 27% was seen after catheterization of the tubes. And if you look at the cumulative pregnancy rate, maximum pregnancies were achieved till about 6 months. And thereafter, you can see that there was no significant increase in the pregnancy rates. And therefore, if the woman does not conceive after 6 months of fallopian tube catheterization, then this patient should be subjected to IVF. Now coming to those women who have undergone sterilization surgeries, here we can see that this systemic review compared laparotomy versus laparoscopy, laparotomy versus robotic surgery, and laparoscopy versus robotic surgery. And they found that basically all the p-values are it's either 0.87, 0.22, or 0.62. And therefore, there was no difference seen in the pregnancy rates, whether the reversal was done laparoscopically or by laparotomy or by robotic surgery, as long as it was done using microsurgical techniques. But we have to take the results, which were shown to be about 42 to 69% with a little pinch of salt again, because there are no RCTs published on this topic. And the population which was selected was also heterogeneous. They reported an ectopic pregnancy rate of 4.8%, and they found that laparoscopic reversal required shorter hospitalization as compared to laparotomy reversal and was less expensive compared to robotic reversal. The only prognostic factor affecting the chance of conception was the female age, and therefore for older women, IVF could be the most cost-effective procedure for than reversal of sterilization. And if you look at the Cochrane review, they said there is no information that is available on factors that can influence the choice between tubal reanastomosis and IVF. So the decision basically then depends on the surgeon as well as the patient. The surgeon needs to review the pros and cons of both tubal anastomosis as well as IVF. And one has to remember that tubal anastomosis should not be considered when the final tubal length is less than 4 centimeters. There are significant tubo-ovarian adhesions with mucosal damage. There is presence of stage 3 or 4 endometriosis. There's presence of male factor, and the female age is more than 37 years. But the decision of the patient is final, and counseling by the surgeon is most important. Coming to endometriosis, we know, which is one of the important causes of infertility, and it has been seen that in patients who have stage 1 and 2 endometriosis, operative laparoscopy, either in the form of excision or ablation of the endometriotic lesions, including adhesivolysis, increases the clinical pregnancy rate as well as the ongoing pregnancy rate when compared to diagnostic laparoscopy alone, and this has a grade A evidence. It was also associated with a small but significant improvement in the live birth rate, and the difference is about 8.6% in favor of surgeries, and the numbers needed to treat was 8. In 2002, Arnhart et al. Reported that the pregnancy rate were halved in women with endometriosis undergoing ART treatment, and the detrimental effect of endometriosis was on implantation as well as on pregnancy rates. Therefore, we need to balance the beneficial and harmful effects of surgery for endometriosis on the reproductive outcome of ART. And this is very important, especially when we counsel our patients for surgery or otherwise. Coming to patients who have endometriomas or deep infiltrating IVF, do they require surgery before IVF? And the answer is no, because we know that cystectomy has a risk of removal of normal ovarian tissue and cortex with primordial follicles, as the endometrioma is surrounded by a fibrotic capsule, and this reduces the AMH as well as the antral follicular count. The ovarian endometriosis ablation also decreases the antral follicular count and AMH, whether we use a bipolar cautery or we use a CO2 laser. So why it should not be operated? Because this was a meta-analysis which was published by Yang et al. And RBM online. And here you can see that there was no effect of removal of endometrioma on the total dose as well as duration of stimulus, but it definitely decreased the number of oocytes retrieved as well as the embryos formed. And again, it did not have any effect on the implantation rate, on the clinical pregnancy rate, as well as the live birth rate. So Eschrey recommends that in women with endometriomas which are larger than 3 centimeters, there is no evidence that cystectomy prior to treatment with ART is going to improve the pregnancy rates, and this has a grade A evidence. In a woman with endometriomas larger than 3 centimeters, the GDG recommends the clinicians only to consider cystectomy prior to ART, only to improve the endometriosis associated pain or the accessibility of follicles. And the clinician must counsel women with endometriomas regarding the risk of reduced ovarian function after surgery and the possible loss of the ovary. Moreover, the decision to proceed with surgery should be considered carefully, more so if a woman has undergone previous ovarian surgeries. Coming to the effect of deep infiltrating endometriosis with endometrioma, there are some studies which showed that they did not have any effect on fertility, whereas there were other studies which showed a negative impact where they found they could either be decreased in the ovarian reserve in terms of antifollicular count and the numbers of oocyte retrieved, and and Balster et al. Showed that it definitely reduced the success rate with IVF. So we can conclude and say that there could be a place of surgery for deep infiltrating endometriosis with endometrioma if there is no pregnancy after 3 IVF-ICSI cycles, or in women who are more than 35 years, it is mandated after failure of 2 IVF-ICSI cycles. Coming to polycystic ovarian disease, there are many who like to drill the ovaries in the presence of PCOS. So if you look at this systemic review and meta-analysis, which compared each option, that it compared clomiphene citrate, it compared letrozole, it compared metformin, it compared clomiphene citrate with metformin and tamoxifen with all the other treatment modalities and with placebo or no intervention, and concluded that all treatment options except for laparoscopic ovarian drilling resulted in a significantly higher pregnancy rates. And if you look at the impact of laparoscopic ovarian drilling on AMH, all these studies published showed that there was a significant decline in the AMH levels post-operatively, and you can see that this decline increases with the time, and at 6 months, it's almost less than half of the original value. But we know that it is as effective as gonadotropin therapy and is the second line of therapy in women with PCOS who want to conceive, because they do have a lesser multiple pregnancy rate. It is more cost effective. It avoids hyperstimulation, and it has an added value of laparoscopy wherein we can detect, as you see in this case, she also had myomas. And basically we know that with today's technology, it is easy and safe. But one must remember that it can have a compromised ovarian function and result in adhesions, and therefore use of proper technique and laparoscopic ovarian diathermy is important to make it a safe procedure. And we can see that there is no difference in the pregnancy rates whether we use gonadotropins or we use laparoscopic ovarian drilling with or without clomiphene citrate in the pregnancy rates. And therefore, if the patient does not have any pelvic pathology, it's better that we use gonadotropins for ovulation induction rather than subjecting the woman to surgery. And these two papers, one, the Cochrane database, and the other, which was published in the American Journal of Laparoscopy, showed that there was no difference in the results of laparoscopic ovarian drilling, whatever the energy was used. When coming to routine laparoscopic diagnostic laparoscopy, whether we should perform it in all our infertility patients, and the answer is no, because many causes of infertility, such as mild endometriosis and severity and extent of adhesions, can only be diagnosed by laparoscopy, but still it should not be done in all patients. It should be considered early in women for more than 35 years of age, who are married for more than 3 years, who have abnormal HSG findings or ultrasound findings. There is history or symptoms suggestive of pelvic disease, elevated chlamydial titers are seen, and when there is history of dyspareunia as well as dysmenorrhea and previous pelvic surgery. It is therefore not cost effective to do diagnostic laparoscopy as a part of initial infertility evaluation, especially when the history, the physical examination, transvaginal scan, HSG, and mid-luteal progesterone are all normal and should be done if patient fails to conceive after 6 ovulatory cycles, and this has a grade B evidence. Again, routine hysteroscopy has no role in evaluation of infertility and should be done early in the presence of abnormal HSG and when there is history or symptoms suggestive of endometrial or uterine pathology. Earlier papers showed a significantly increase in the pregnancy rate when a routine outpatient hysteroscopy was done in the absence of any pathology and with a definite increase in the pregnancy rates, both before IVF, where the numbers needed to treat was 6, or in patients who had recurrent implantation failures. But then the INSIGHT study, which was a multicentric randomized controlled trial, showed that there was no benefit of a routine hysteroscopy before first ever IVF because the pregnancy rates were almost similar. The TROPHY trial then looked at patients who had recurrent implantation failure. And again, this trial showed that there was no benefit of doing a routine hysteroscopy in women with recurrent implantation failure. In the same year, Sardo et al. Published this paper, and he concluded that according to the data which is currently available, no firm conclusions can be made of the effect of diagnostic or operative hysteroscopy on the pregnancy outcome. Hysteroscopy or no hysteroscopy prior to any first or subsequent IVF ICSI attempt in an infertile woman without intrauterine abnormalities does not improve the live birth rate. And when we compare operative hysteroscopy for intrauterine abnormalities in infertile women with already diagnosed polyps or fibroids, there was a low quality evidence that that operative hysteroscopy increased the pregnancy rate in this group of patients. Coming to endometrial scratch, with I think many ERT surgeons are still performing. And there was an era about 10 years back when it became a procedure to be done for all undergoing IVF. But does it have evidence? I think no, because the opinion has changed over the past 10 years. And this is because the earlier studies which were performed had a very small sample size. There were a lot of methodological flaws in these studies. They included a heterogeneous population. They also used different scratching techniques and they showed statistical heterogeneity. In 2015, Cochrane Review said that there is moderate quality evidence for improvement in live birth rate and clinical pregnancy rate in women who previous failed embryo transfers when endometrial injury was performed between day 7 or the previous cycle and day 7 of the embryo transfer cycle. But then there were 2 more studies in 2017 and 2019, which showed that endometrial scratch in the luteal phase of the cycle preceding the natural cycle FET in an unselected group of women does not improve the implantation as well as the pregnancy rates. And then came in this large meta-analysis published in 2019, and it showed that there was no difference in the live birth rates, and also there was no difference in the miscarriage rate. There was another meta-analysis in the same year. Here, what they did is they excluded the confounding factors like age and the number of failed IVF cycles, and they found that there was no statistical difference in the live birth rates as well as the miscarriage rates, and therefore they concluded that endometrial injury should be used restrictively and not as a routine procedure. So looking at controversial evidence, BMJ has induced a study which is called as the SCRATCH study, which is a multicentric randomized controlled trial which is going to recruit more than 1,000 women over 16 fertility units. And this study has been commenced in 2017 January and was going to be completed in June 2019, but the data yet has not been published. So once we get this data, then we can conclude for ourselves whether we should or we should not do endometrial scratch before any IVF procedure. We've spoken a lot about ART, so I just thought I would put one slide on the use of diagnostic and or operative laparoscopy prior to IUI treatment. And this paper, which was published in 2005, and was an RCT, and it included about 154 infertile women for IUI, and they showed that there was no evidence of a treatment effect of laparoscopy prior to IUI on ongoing pregnancy rate per patient compared to immediate treatment with IUI. And therefore, in the absence of pathology, I do not think that a diagnostic laparoscopy is going to improve the pregnancy rates with IUI. So I would like to conclude by saying that reproductive surgery may be complementary before IVF to enhance its success, especially when we do adhesiolisis so that the ovaries can be accessed transvaginally by when we do an oocyte retrieval. Probably we may need to remove large endometriomas which preclude the access to follicular aspiration and in the presence of hydrosalpinx. And therefore, not all surgeries can improve IVF outcome, and this point should be remembered. So, the reproductive surgeries indicated beyond a reasonable doubt are adhesions around the fallopian tube, ovaries, or the ampulla, which have level 2 or 3 evidence, intramural myomas more than 5 centimeters, and those close to the junctional zone, which has level 2 evidence. Hydrosalpinx has level 1 evidence, whereas tubectomy reversal has level 2 or 3 evidence. Hysteroscopic surgeries for polyps and submucous myomas has level 1 evidence, whereas intrauterine adhesiolisis and metroplasty has level 2 to 3 evidence. And the surgeries which have contradictory evidence include ovarian drilling in PCOS, which is a second-line treatment, endometriosis and endometriomas or recurrent endometriomas, deep rectovaginal endometriosis without pain, presence of adenomyosis, severe tubal disease or occlusions due to infective pelvic pathology, or a routine laparoscopy, hysteroscopy, and endometrial scratch. I thank you all for a patient hearing. So let's go to the questions. So the first question is from Asmita Tiwari from Ahmedabad. Who is asked as to what are the risks of treatment and are there any long-term effects? How likely do you think it is your recommended treatments will result in a live birth rate based on my individual situation, that is my partner? Over what period of time would you expect it to occur? I would like to know what is this question related to? I mean, risk of treatment, wherein you talk about which pathology, because both these questions are almost on the same lines from Sita from Chennai. So whether you want to talk about myomas, you want to talk about adhesions, hydrosalpinx. Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I mean, they've written vague questions. So each pathology has a different risk. So they need to tell which pathology they're looking at.
Okay, ma'am, you can just script that question. I think they can see you answer it and they'll put it the right way.
Yeah. Then there's a question from Harsha Patil from Bangalore. How many cycles of treatment should be recommended before trying a different treatment? So if I think we should gradually increase if the patient does not have any pathology which has been detected either by ultrasound or we have done a HLG that we have shown that there is tubal patency, the male factor is normal and the female factor also is normal, or she just has anovulatory cycles wherein we can induce ovulation. We can do 3 to 4 cycles of ovulation induction with timed intercourse. If she does not conceive, then we move on to an IUI cycle. We do normally 2 cycles with oral ovulagens because we know that the success rate of IUI with oral ovulagens is about 10 to 12%. And conceive, then we move on to gonadotrophins with IUI, which has a success rate of about 15 to 18%. And if she does not conceive with 4 cycles or at the most 5 cycles of IUI, it's then best to move on to ART. Bhavik from Mumbai is asking ovarian drilling should be at what stage? So as I told you, according to the ASHRAE guidelines, basically ovarian drilling is the second line of treatment. But we have also seen that the gonadotrophins also have same results as ovarian drilling. And if there is no pathology, I do not think ovarian drilling should be done, because if overdone, or if the patient has tendency of developing adhesions, there could be decreased ovarian reserve as well as adhesions, and then requiring IVF. But if the patient cannot come for regular monitoring, then probably we could try ovarian drilling, especially in a woman who is thin and who has high LH levels. There is another question from Charu Mittal from Gwalior, who is saying, what is the current status of premenstrual DNC with endometrial biopsy, which was regularly practiced? Today, there is no role of a premenstrual DNC or an endometrial biopsy which is practiced, but an endometrial biopsy may be required in patients wherein you find that she has a thin endometrium despite good follicular size and E2 levels. And second, you feel that there is the irregular, you can see irregularity at the border of the endometrium, that is at the junctional zone. And if the patient does have a history of tuberculosis in the past, that is either pulmonary tuberculosis or lymphadenopathies, then probably there could be a silent pelvic tuberculosis. And these are the cases where endometrial biopsy may be required. Gande from Mumbai is asking, can you please elaborate the side effects of surgery if it's done at before the recommended stage? Probably if you're good at surgeries, you might not have any side effects. But if you overdo any surgery, probably it's not good for the patient. And then you should also look at the cost which is incurred for the surgery. If you're doing surgery on the ovaries, especially if she has a simple cyst, she has a dermoid, she has an endometrioma, or she has endometriotic deposits on the ovary, then probably the surgery can reduce the ovarian reserve. Coming to Isha Sharma's question, was from Delhi. How effective is reproductive surgery by laparoscopy in subfertile women compared to alternative treatments? I think my whole lecture was on that, and my last two slides showed that which reproductive surgery is essential and the surgeries which have controversial views, wherein some say that it is advantageous and some say it is not advantageous. Basically, in patients who have any intrauterine pathology, definitely a surgery is required, and it has shown to improve the pregnancy rates. And when you come to laparoscopic surgery, and hydrosalpinx definitely needs to be treated. If there are adhesions, they also need to be definitely treated. Again, endometrioma, there is controversial evidence. If it is big enough and you are having difficulty in accessing your follicles, it should definitely be removed. But if you do not have, there's no need to remove these endometriomas. Whereas all the other surgeries may or may not help in increasing the pregnancy rates. Sahil K from Baroda asks how to prevent adhesions after reproductive surgery. Yeah, so as when you're using cautery, probably immediately you need to cool down the tissue by using normal saline, and you get several anti-adhesives now which are available, which can be used to prevent adhesions. Charu Mittal from Gwalior asks, what is your experience about the overall prevalence of cervical stenosis alone as a cause of subfertility? I think if you do a good ultrasound scan and you use a 3D scan, you can really know the direction of the cervical canal. And therefore, when you're doing procedures like IUI, it might help you to visualize what you've seen in an ultrasound and proceed doing an IUI. It is basically not the stenosis, but it's the direction of the cervical canal which you need to look at. So despite identifying the cervical canal on an ultrasound, you still have difficulty in cannulating the cervix, then probably this could be one of the patient who requires an hysteroscope, diagnostic hysteroscopy, wherein we can identify the cervical canal, the internal os, the direction of the cervical canal. And at times I've seen that we could have some adhesions or polyps in the cervical canal, which preclude you to enter the uterine cavity, and these can be treated. Sneha B from Chennai is asking, what is the effectiveness of hysteroscopic metroplasty with recurrent pregnancy loss? As I said, a septum always needs to be resected, and it has definitely reduced the recurrent pregnancy loss. But the role of lateral metroplasty is again controversial, and most studies have shown that it results in more destruction of the normal endometrium than has an advantage of increasing the pregnancy rates. Any more questions?
Yes, ma'am. I think there's one more.
Yeah. Yeah. How effective is hysteroscopy in patients with recurrent IVF failure? I showed you that there were so many studies now which have been published, and the largest study is the Trophy trial, which was done, which looked at routine hysteroscopy in women who had recurrent implantation failure, and they said that it really did not help in increasing either the implantation rate, the clinical pregnancy rate, or the live birth rate. So a routine hysteroscopy really does not have any role in a woman before her first ever IVF or who has got recurrent implantation failure unless an intrauterine pathology has been diagnosed. So this question is, what do you do if you find difficulty in HSG due to cervical stenosis? So I think as I already answered this question, and if you have difficulty, I think hysteroscopy is the best method because it's going to tell us about the direction of the cervical and also the position of the internal os, which will then help us in accessing the uterine cavity. Harsha K from Mumbai is asking, does laparoscopic removal of ultrasonographically diagnosed hydrosalpinx double the birth rate? Yes, if you do not remove the hydrosalpinx, the success rate of any ERT procedure is only about 15 to 20%, as against about 35 to 45% if you remove the hydrosalpinx. So it definitely, if you don't remove it, the success rate is almost 50% of that what it would have been. There was a question from Sapna who is asking on effect of medicine compared to surgical procedures. So basically this comes only for patients with PCOS, and it has been seen that there is no difference in the clinical pregnancy rates as well as the live birth rates if you do ovarian drilling or you use gonadotrophins for ovulation induction, which is the second line of treatment in women with PCOS.
I think, ma'am, we can end if there's no more questions.
Yeah.
So just the take-home message for us.
Yeah. So the take-home message is basically we have to evaluate each and every patient. So a very good clinical examination, a good ultrasound scan, which should include both a 2D and 3D, will direct us as to which patient is going to benefit from surgery and which patient is not going to benefit. It's very important for us to counsel our patients when we take them off surgery, because we need to tell them the success rate following surgery, as well as the success rate of an IVF when in lieu, especially when you're doing it for tubal pathologies. So counseling forms the most important part, and your initial clinical examination and ultrasound is very important, which will help us in deciding as to whether the surgical procedure should be done or not. There was one more question from Dr. Charu Mittal. So she's asking about the pre-op use of misoprostol before, and the dose route and what time prior to the procedure. In case you find that you're really going to have difficulty in dilating the cervix, probably you could put 200 micrograms of misoprostol vaginally about 2 hours before surgery, and this would help you in dilatation. But in routine cases, I don't think it's required.